Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Owen and Patt Morrison to the stage.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll be able to get to your questions, too. The book is Where the Water Goes, Life and Death Along the Colorado River, and it could be the life and death of all of us, as we're going to find out, grim as that sounds. I think the only American who ever profitably overslept was Rip Van Winkle. He went to sleep under King George III and woke up with George Washington, which I think is a pretty darn good deal. As far as the water itself goes, the situation that we're going to be talking about is how the water comes to Southern California, the fact that the water is over-allocated. Every gallon that we're going to be talking about today is not only promised once over, it may be promised 2 or 3 times, which is like somebody getting engaged to 3 different people and scheduling the wedding on the same day, right? Everybody's going to show up, and it's going to be, oh my God, where did we go? So the water that we have is not just the water that comes down out of the sky. It's a product of a lot of engineering and labor and great distances, too. So I'd like you to talk about how we engineer the water, even the water that we have in our bottles today.
It's sort of remarkable, and my book is about the Colorado River, which is 1,400 miles long. It's not terribly long, but it supplies water to an astonishing number of people, almost 40 million people all over the western United States. And many of the largest users of that water don't even realize that their water is coming from the Colorado or from its tributaries. So water from the Colorado goes across the Rocky Mountains into Denver and the other Front Range cities. It goes to Salt Lake City. It goes to Los Angeles. It comes right here to Palm Springs. There are Colorado River water users all over the western United States.
And how many states? I mean, the drainage basin is 250,000 square miles.
Yeah,
right?
and it's not. It's kind of a dinky river for all that. The Mississippi River carries as much water as the Colorado carries in a year. The Mississippi carries that much water every couple of weeks, and so we make extremely efficient use of Colorado River water. In fact, so much so that we entirely use it up. There's a place in Mexico that's named for the Colorado River, where the Colorado River doesn't even run to anymore, and there's a toll bridge that crosses the channel of the Colorado River, and there are people who complain about having to pay a 6 peso toll to cross just sand, which is what you cross at that.
Because there's no water in it.
We've used it, yes, we literally use it all up.
You have a wonderful story in the book about how the Spanish first perceived the Colorado when they saw it.
Nobody really knew what to do with the Grand Canyon, which was carved by the Colorado River. And when the first explorers looked down from below, they thought it was just a trickle at the bottom, like maybe 8 feet wide, because the distance is so remarkable. And if you stand on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, you can see how they could be fooled. And yet it's this vital, it's been called the American Nile because it's so important to the United States. It irrigates 6 million acres of agricultural land, and much of that land it itself created with this enormous flows of silt that come down the river from beginning in the Rocky Mountains and going all the way down, originally to the Gulf of California, which it doesn't exactly reach anymore. It has been a major supplier of green energy to the United States. 2 of the biggest hydroelectric plants at Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam are on the Colorado. 2 of the very largest, I think they were the number 1 and number 2 largest reservoirs in the United States until we drained more than half of them. I think the Lake Mead now is about 38% full. Lake Powell's roughly the same. The 2 of them together don't hold as much water as Lake Mead alone did just as recently as 1998. So it's.
How did we come to treat the Colorado River as if it were an East Coast river like the Mississippi? And there's water for everybody, let's do everything.
Yeah, it's very complicated. In the West, water law is treated in an entirely different way from the way it is in the East.
Oh yeah, this is crazy. Get a load of this.
In the East, if you live on a stream, if you have a farm on a stream, you share. If you own property next to a stream, you share your right to use that water with the other people who own property on the stream. It's not the way it works in the West, And the reason for that is that during early Western history, during the gold rush in California, and then in the slightly later gold rush in Colorado, if I need water to prospect to run through my sluice box because I'm mining for gold. If a later claimant comes along upstream from me and uses water too, I don't have enough to run my sluice box anymore. So you couldn't do what you could do in the East, which is to share water equitably, because once you shared it, there wasn't enough for anybody. And so the West evolved an entirely different scheme of law, known as first in time, first in right, or prior appropriation, which basically means that the first person to make what's called a beneficial use of water gains the right to use that much water for that purpose forever. And that's
no matter who else may be building downstream. So conceivably, my priorities for my hot tub are more important than your priorities for your hospital.
They could be, and there are places they're probably both the hospital and the hot tub came along too late to really be anywhere near the top of the line. But if you have two farmers on a river and they have the older claim has a right to a certain amount of water, and if the river cannot satisfy both that right and the junior rights, then the senior right gets all his water first. There's no sharing. So this is an issue, especially for Arizona, because as a result of a complicated legal case, California is senior to all of Arizona. So if the Colorado River can't supply,
even though the Grand Canyon is in Arizona,
right? It's right. It has nothing. And even though California doesn't contribute any water to the Colorado, the Colorado forms the border between Arizona and Colorado. And this is why there's a tremendous amount of decades-old tension between Arizona and California. And in fact, it was the rapid growth of California in the early part of the 20th century that led to the dividing up of the river the way it was. States at the northern end of the river, up in Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, began to worry that if they didn't do something, California was going to develop so fast that California would establish priority claims to all the water in the river, and nobody above California would be able to use any of it. So there were these agonized, angry negotiations for more than a year. Herbert Hoover was he was the Secretary of Commerce, and he was sort of the moderator. And they ended up dividing the river among 7 states. They left out Mexico initially. The United States hadn't even decided that Mexico had any right to water from this river that actually flows through Mexico. And the American Indian tribes were mentioned only in a single sentence. There was nothing that anybody nowadays would recognize as a concern for the environment. This is all about conservation in the old sense, which conservation meant we extract every penny of economic value from this river before we waste it by allowing it to flow into the ocean.
And one thing that struck me in your book, but if you have rights to a certain amount of water, you need to use it all up, whether you have any use for it or not. So you can just go ahead and waste it while the guy downstream is turning on his taps and getting nothing coming out of it.
Right. Yes, you have the right. You have the right to, as long as you're using it for that purpose that you're allowed to use it for.
Even a gallon of it.
And so this was a concern too to Arizona. Arizona had gained the right to a certain amount of water from the Colorado, but they had no way to access it because they couldn't get it over to where they needed it. Once they could, then they've done things like pour water into the desert to soak it into the ground, to store it,
to hide it,
so that California wouldn't take it. And they had a legitimate concern, which is what actually happened, which was that if there was extra water in the river, California was entitled to use more than its legal allotment, and they did. But once you have Los Angeles and San Diego and the Imperial Valley, it's hard to shut the valve on those, and so people upstream were worried that their water was going to go away.
And
it's hard to believe it, but it's all actually much more complicated than
that. There have been legislative efforts over the years that if you're going to build a housing development, you have to prove where 20 years water supply is coming from. But as it is now in a lot of places, you can just build like on a monopoly board, as if there's nothing underneath it, no water, no nothing. You don't have to account for it. You don't have to say there's enough to keep the water coming to your house, which you just bought for 20 years.
Right, and often the people who supply the water and the people who make the rules about it are different people. So they're not forming these rules working together based on some understanding of how much water there might be. They're sort of theoretical rules that aren't necessarily anchored in reality.
Now, everybody's seen the movie The Producers, right? The theory is you make a whole lot of money on a bad play by selling 1,000,000% of it. And so how did we end up selling more or distributing more from Colorado River water than there actually is of Colorado River water?
Well, there are a number of accidents, and Western water lawyers distinguish two kinds of water. There's paper water, which is what they deal with, and then there's wet water, which is almost insignificant by comparison with paper water. When the states divided up the river, they had the bad luck to do it at a moment that was probably the wettest in the history of the Colorado River. So the quantity that they believed was in the river was actually, it was an optical illusion. There was much less, on average, there's much less water than what they divided up. So the legal division of water is based on a fiction. And then in addition to that, there are further complications, but there are many, many claims on water in the river. One of them is the American Indian tribes, which were overlooked initially. There was a Supreme Court decision which ruled rationally and justly that the United States would not have forced American Indian tribes to become agrarians if they didn't mean for them to have the irrigation water they needed to do that on the land they had been given. And so there was a Supreme Court decision and then subsequent court decisions which said that the tribes have a priority claim. Their priority claim is dated with the creation of the reservation, which is usually before any other claim on the water. They don't have to use the water or lose it. That claim doesn't go away. They can sell their right. And there are others. In theory, the tribes could have claim to probably more than all the water that's in the river, or a substantial percentage of the water that's in the river.
Your construct for this book was traveling along the Colorado
Yes.
River, and you found it, you maybe have thought this was going to be a nice sort of little backpacking trip and beautiful and exotic and come back with great adventures, but you couldn't even get to the river in some cases.
Oh, yeah. There's lots of it is protected by our amazing national park system. And so for a big stretch, the Grand Canyon, if you take a raft trip down the Grand Canyon, you get in at Lee's Ferry, you get out 260 miles downstream, because that's the next place you can get a vehicle down to the water. So much of the river is inaccessible. But what I was interested in was not, being John Muir and rafting down the river, but seeing all the places where we bleed water out of the river and water into it, and the economic value it has, the importance it is, the different kinds of people who depend on the river, and it's interesting, and I think that sort of the less you know about probably any issue, the easier it is to solve that issue, because it's very simple. But then once you raise the lid on some of these things, and you see,
Including the toilet lid, I guess.
right? We fix this. Well, then that puts all these people out of business, or we do what seems like an environmentally responsible move here, and that actually has terrible consequences there. And this is where we are right now is a good example of that. The Salton Sea is
I want to get to that in a minute, but people do say, here's a solution. How about in Las Vegas, you turn off all those stupid fountains? And that would save you some water, and then what?
Well, the thing about Las Vegas is, of all the cities that draw water from the Colorado River, Las Vegas is the closest. It's like 30 miles from the river, from Lake Mead. And so as a result, people tend to think of it as the only city that's drawing water down. You look at Lake Mead and you see this bathtub ring. It's a 130-foot tall white strip that goes around. And then you look at the fountains at the Bellagio and you think, well, there's the problem. But in fact, when the river was divided up, Las Vegas didn't exist. It was like a town of 5,000 people. Nevada barely existed. Nevada's share of river water is tiny. The main reason, if you took Nevada's entire annual allotment of Colorado river water out of Lake Mead just drained it out one moment, the level of the lake would fall by a little over 50 inches. If you took California's annual allotment out of it one blow, it would fall by more than 50 feet. So it's not Las Vegas. And those fountains at the Bellagio, it's about 64 acre-feet of water. It's 8 acres, 8 feet deep, which we
Per
probably
day,
use
per year?
that's how much it contains. I don't know how
Oh,
much of that evaporates, but that's what you couldn't even water the golf course right here at the hotel where I'm staying with that pretty much. So it's not a lot of water.
So we shouldn't pick on Las Vegas.
We shouldn't pick on Las Vegas. And furthermore, people assume that if we get into real trouble, if the lake goes really low, Las Vegas will be the only place to suffer. In fact, it'll probably be the only major user in the lower part of the river that won't suffer at all, because they've built this enormously expensive, what they call the third straw. It's the third intake that's down below the level of the lake that's known as Dead Pool, which is the part of the lake that's below the lowest intake in Hoover Dam. And it's about 180 feet below the surface now. Once it goes down there, no water goes through the dam. Nothing comes down to California, to Arizona, to Mexico. But Las Vegas will still be taking water out of the lake.
So the eastern part of this country was cultivated around water wheels for energy, water for navigation. It built canals when it needed them before the railroad to move things around. How is it that the West got so big on so little water? Were we just deluding ourselves this whole time?
Well, it's amazing, and it turns out that right here is a good example. The Imperial Valley, or the Coachella Valley right here, these agricultural areas. Before they were agricultural areas, it was dust, it was sand, and it was hot. And people realized at the late in the 19th century that if you had water there, you could grow stuff on it. It was good soil. It's all this silt that's come down from the Grand Canyon. It's basically what's missing from the Grand Canyon. It's pretty level. It's growing season all year long. And all you need is water. So initially they were able to pump water out of the ground. Then they hauled it from the Colorado, and then they built canals and brought it over. And even today, it's a very productive agricultural area. If you eat, in my part of the country, if you eat lettuce in the winter, you're probably eating Imperial Valley lettuce. I traveled. I went around. A farmer in the Imperial Valley gave me a tour of his bed, and he showed me these sheets of where he'd planted stuff the day that these onions had been planted, the day they would be harvested. He knew to the day when everything he planted was going to harvest. And you look at my part of the country, farmers don't know when they're going to be able to plant. They don't know when they're going to be able to harvest. Everything could be wiped out the way apples were 2 years ago. And he gets more than one crop because there's no frost. And when I visited his farm, it had rained a little bit that day. California was in drought, and I said, maybe I should be congratulated for bringing rain, since it arrived with me. And he said, we really don't like rain. We don't plant around it because it just throws everything off. Because they get 2 inches of rain a year, he knows exactly how much he's watering. That's why he has that kind of control. So there are advantages to growing things in a desert that you wouldn't think there would be.
And that's how we drew so many people, agriculture first, and then other labor, water-intensive uses.
Yes. It's like the climate here. There's a lot to be said for it. All you need is water. Add water, and it's pretty great.
That's one example of someone who lives close to the water needs and the water supply. Or a couple other people you've talked to who you thought were very interesting and realistic in their approaches.
In western Colorado, I visited a couple who have a winery, and they were interested in wine. They saw that a vineyard was for sale in western Colorado, and they bought it. And it's one of those it's like green acres, pretty much. They hadn't really thought it through when they did it. So everything is more complicated than they thought it was going to be. One of the complications is that.
And the old owner walked away going, hey, hey, hey.
Right, exactly. We've never had a frost in 15 years. And then all their grapevines died. But even if they hadn't died, most of the vineyards there have to buy grapes from other places to make large parts of their wine. And then they depend, as this vineyard did, on its wine tasting room, basically a bar that's open 365 days a year. And you think, well, this is mildly insane, but it's the whole economy of the Grand Valley depends. People come to drink the wine. They bring their bicycles. They have a wine festival. And it's people. It's in large part it's people who live in the Grand Valley hate, which is people who live in Denver because they're stealing their water on the other side. But if they weren't coming to drink the wine, they'd all be. So everything is locked together. And it's also what's true of New York. Is if you took the people in Colorado on the west side of the mountains really hate the people on the east side of the mountains. But if you took all the people on the east side of the mountains, it's like 85% of the population, and spread them out to the west of the mountains where they could take water out of the ground, nobody would be happy. So everybody, we depend on each other in complicated ways.
And what about the large farming undertakings, the industrial scale agriculture versus the guys who have wineries or just grow their own, a small crop?
Yeah, this is a whole complicated issue there too, and it's I think one of the great mysteries of the environmental movement is the idea that small farmers are virtuous and green. We really it doesn't scale up to the world, to the globe, so it's complicated. Organic farming is more thirsty and more hungry for land than non-organic farming is. There are lots of reasons.
With a lower yield?
With a lower yield, higher, it's another one of these issues. Once you start peeling it back, you realize, this is all pretty complicated. And it wouldn't be enough to just cut down all the almond trees. There's more to it than that.
The outflow of the Colorado was the Sea of Cortez. Now, good luck with navigating it all the way to the Sea of Cortez. What's
Right.
happening?
Well, yeah, it's the Gulf of California, the thing that looks like the armpit of Baja California.
Hey.
The
He's from Connecticut. He can't get away with that stuff.
That's why it's sort of like the Baja California kind of hangs on like an arm. The Colorado used to flow into that, the Sea of Cortez at the top. And now it doesn't. It hasn't all by itself since it's only once since the 1960s, or all by itself. And then in 2014 it did. There was an intentional release of 100,000 acre-feet of water, which is 200,000 Olympic swimming pools of water, that a pulse flow that went all the way down, got all the way to the Gulf of California. By the time it got there, it was like a slushy from
Did they
7-Eleven.
have like a ribbon cutting or something? Here comes the water.
Well, sort of. People got the word, and so there were people along the river who had lived next to the Colorado River for their whole lives and never seen water in it, and so they came down to watch the water come down, and it's pretty remarkable. I went to with an American environmentalist and a Mexican environmentalist. We drove into Mexico, and we went to where the water in the river runs out, and it really runs out pretty much right at the border. There's a dam there that diverts essentially all of the Colorado River into a canal system in Mexico, all of what's left of it. But we found the place where there's sort of the last water in the river channel. You could jump. I'm in Mexico, I'm in the United States, jumping back and forth. It's only about as wide as a sidewalk. But you see evidence of where, the road that we drove on was on a levee that was about a dozen feet above the surface on either side. It was a levee. It was a mile from the river. It had been built to protect houses on the other side from water flowing over. And we had to get off and hike to find this trickle, which the Mexican environmentalist explained was really probably just groundwater gains. It was just water trickling up, and the reason there was groundwater to trickle up was that irrigating farmers on the Arizona side of the border had over-irrigated, and the water was sort of leaking under.
That hurts. You point out how environmentalism was not a consideration early on. How has that changed? How has it changed the demands on the water? Because one thing we've learned is that the interdependency, you can't just like you say, you can't shut off the fountains of the Bellagio. You can't say we can do without this species, but not without this species.
Right. No, it's very hard. Although we're getting to the point where being so careless with species that there was one environmentalist I talked to who said, maybe we should start triaging, species. Maybe the endangered species list is an impediment, and you decide, well,
Impediment to what?
To making it possible for anything to survive. We have very dramatically changed the environment every place that we've lived. So I don't know that you can even talk about a natural environment anymore. We have places where we have made efforts to simulate something like it. And there are places along the Colorado where it's like that. But it's like, even in the parts of the river that we think of as wild, really the Colorado River today, it's like It's a 1,400-mile-long water delivery system. It's not a river. It doesn't, if you read John Muir's accounts of going down the river, they talked about these, waves that were like 100 feet up the side of the canyons. That doesn't happen anymore. There's a faucet at the top that controls what goes down, and that has environmental consequences too, because there are whole ecosystems that depended on periodically being just completely, swept off the table by these amazing flows of water that don't flow anymore. And so different plant species grow. The water's a different temperature, different turbidity, different animals, different fish. We tend to change pretty much everything when we change anything.
So everyone will want to hear about the Salton Sea, what it was before, what it is now, what it will be.
Right here, we're virtually in what was once the Gulf of California. It came up pretty much as far as this. And you can see it, if you look on Google Earth, you can see that there's this, what I'd call the armpit comes up farther than the water does. And what happened was, periodically over the eons-long history of the river, rivers don't stay in one place. In the Colorado, as it came down, it would sweep around like a water hose in your yard if you let it go, and spraying this enormous tide of sediment across the southwestern United States, building up the enormous deposits of silt, and then also at one point kind of damming off the upper end of the Gulf of California, and it created this gigantic lake, Lake Cahuilla, right really pretty much where we are now. And that evaporated, leaving lots of sediment, and then it would fill as the Colorado River came back, and evaporated, filled, evaporated, came back, many times over thousands of years. Then in the late 1800s, as farmers began farming in the Imperial Valley, and they were diverting water from the Colorado over to this new place where they were going to grow crops, they decided to repair the channel because silt was filling it up, and they accidentally diverted the entire Colorado River into this basin, the Salton Sink. For a year and a half, the whole Colorado River flowed into it. There was so
it was the Salton Sea.
Right. It was the Salton Sink. It was this sort of what was left of this prehistoric lake that had evaporated, and suddenly the river was flowing into it for a year and a half. And when it did, it wiped out towns, it wiped out railroad line. There was like a 20-foot wall of water that was working its way back to the river. And it took a year and a half, and I can't remember how many hundreds or thousands of railroad cars full of enormous boulders to sort of get it back into its channel. When they did that, it was left with this 400 square mile lake, the Salton Sea, which would have evaporated long since if in the 1920s farmers in the Imperial Valley hadn't begun dumping their wastewater into it. And that created a kind of equilibrium. The Salton Sea became, as they would irrigate their fields in the Imperial Valley, the water would run off. They needed some place to put it.
With the fertilizer and everything.
With everything in it, they channeled it into the Salton Sea. And it kind of kept it made it look like what the developer, in fact, of Palm Springs, it was pitched as like the next Lake Tahoe. And it was an enormous vacation destination. Guy Lombardo raced his boat there. You look at old postcards and you see people water skiing and people on the beaches. People built houses, and you can go down there. You can drive down there now, and you can buy any number of real estate lots for probably the change in your pocket. You have willing sellers lined up to sell them to you because it's not a very, you smell it before you see it. The reason is that there's no water leaves that lake except by evaporation and a little bit of seepage into the ground, so it's become saltier and saltier. For a while, when it was the next Lake Tahoe, it was stocked with game fish. People would come to fish there. Now it's like the hardiest of the hardy tilapia are left, and other than that, pretty much nothing.
It's real Darwinian, right?
Yeah, it's pretty much. We see it's like us against, it's man versus nature, and the tilapia are the last contestants. The Salton Sea is a complicated issue because it was created by this act of enormous engineering imbecility, this terrible accident. And in that sense, it's this huge environmental disaster. And then it was kept alive by this environmental practice of dumping agricultural wastewater into it. But now that's stopping because Southern California needs water. The farmers in the Imperial Valley, by law, now have to be much more efficient in their irrigation, so there's less runoff. And so it's really starting this year that water, there used to be 1 million acre-feet of water, of agricultural water that went into the Salton Sea. That will be cut to about 500,000. If you leave the Salton Sea all by itself, it evaporates. It loses about 6 feet of water a year. And it's going to be more like that. It's going to evaporate a lot. As it sinks, it exposes its lake bed, which was nasty to begin with, and it's nastier now after a century of dumping agricultural wastewater products into it.
So it'd be a Superfund site if it were left.
If there were any money in the if there were Superfund, yes. If we had, so it's an issue for Palm Springs, because this is Palm Springs and really all up into metropolitan LA is in what's called the airshed of the Salton Sea. So as the winds pick up the stuff and blow, already in this area has the asthma rate, childhood asthma rate, is a multiple of what it is in other places because of all this airborne stuff, and nobody really knows what the consequences are.
Well, this is what happened with the Owens Valley when Los Angeles took the water. When it dried up, it created this toxic dust that became unhealthy, so it's a multiplier.
Right, and this is even nastier dust.
So is the effort to save the Salton Sea, as you see on the bumper stickers, is it quixotic? Is it pointless?
It's not quixotic, but it's difficult. One possibility people have talked about is bringing water from the Pacific Ocean or from the Gulf of California and adding it to, replacing it. You spend billions of dollars to dig a tunnel. The difficulty with that is that even though the Salton Sea is saltier than the ocean, you can't reduce the saltiness of the Salton Sea by adding ocean water to it, because the big factor is evaporation. Right now, the water that goes into it, the agricultural runoff, is a tiny fraction as salty as ocean water, and yet the salinity of the Salton Sea is still going up. So if you replace that with ocean water, it would just go up even faster. Because you haven't solved that evaporation problem. A solution that has been tested and has some chance of winning is to try to make more use of this 500,000 acre-feet of water that will still be dumped into the Salton Sea by spreading it out more, basically building dikes and trying to cover more of the exposed lake bed with less water, which not only keeps that stuff from blowing around, but preserves what's now the largest wetland in the state of California. It's a major stopping place on the Pacific Flyway.
Because we've destroyed so many others.
Because we've destroyed so many others. As birds come flying up the West Coast, they stop there. So I think probably, and there have been some experiments that show that you can make use of that. And as an environmentalist said to me with the Pacific Institute, he said, having 500,000 acre-feet of water for any environmental purpose is, it's beyond anything. So he is optimistically pessimistic, I would say. He feels that they have a resource that they can make use of. The difficulty is that all these things cost money. And as he says, it's very hard if you're a politician, to make a case that we need to spend billions of dollars to preserve this environmental disaster that we created through our own imbecility, and now we want to preserve forever. It's a hard case to make. It doesn't fit easily into a slogan.
I want to get to questions in a minute, but to sum up what we've been talking about here, as far as the whole Colorado River water system, it doesn't sound like we'll be getting a solution, but a crisis instead.
Maybe. I think the good thing about water in terms of solutions is that if you don't have water, it's a problem you have to solve immediately, because we die if we don't, very quickly without water, much faster than without food. And so when places have water crises, they find solutions. And we've actually seen that kind of over and over in the West. Right now, oddly enough, one of the powerful motivating forces is the sort of hatred of the federal government in the West. Virtually all the water infrastructure in the West was built by all U.S. taxpayers. It's built with tax money. It's built by the federal government. The dams, the irrigation canals. But the states think of this as their water. They don't want the federal government interfering. So they have been more accommodating with each other than they probably, out of fear that the Department of the Interior will step in, than they probably would have otherwise. And so they're actually, you have the states exploring very innovative, creative ways to try to be better at protecting this resource that they all depend on. And part of it has to do with this incredibly complicated legal structure that they've erected around it, where you don't want, California doesn't want to make arguments about other states that might undermine its sort of shaky claims on the water, and the other states feel the same way. So they kind of realize that nobody wants to test this sort of rickety legal structure that they've built, and they have been kind of accommodating. One of the examples is the agreement between the United States and Mexico that led to this pulse of water that went all the way to the Gulf of California. It's very unusual as you have a very rich country and a very poor country came to an international agreement for an environmental purpose, which pretty much doesn't happen. And everybody, it was part of a larger agreement in which both countries felt they came out ahead, and it made people optimistic in other areas too, that these problems are addressable in a way that sometimes other problems are not.
I'm glad to hear the states may be working this out amicably, because I'd hate to think of them having metal detectors at the Utah, Nevada, California water meetings. So let's get some questions from you about this. So we'll start here, and then we'll jump around, please. And I have to repeat the question, so to address it to me, please.
If one assumes that someday the Colorado River would go dry as to supplying all the people, as massive people, would it be a problem solver if they dug a gigantic river from the Pacific Ocean, desalinate the water at the ocean, and then take it to the headwater and bring it on down?
Okay, I'll have to repeat the question. That with the fact that we have so many more people, no more water to spare, what about the prospect of digging a canal or a tunnel to take Pacific Ocean water to the headwaters of the Colorado or near there and use that as a sort of substitute for the water that isn't coming
After taking
through
the salt out. Yeah, I think the theft schemes that have been proposed usually involve stealing the Columbia River or the Great Lakes.
Or bringing
rather-
icebergs down,
Yeah,
actually, from
icebergs. Well,
the Arctic.
the difficulty with desalination as a solution is it's very expensive. It's very energy hungry. And until very recently, there was only one ocean to freshwater desalination plant in the United States. It was in Tampa, Florida. There's now a second in San Diego. But both of those plants, they're expensive to operate. They don't supply a whole lot of water. The one in Tampa, I think it adds up to about 2% of the local freshwater use in the Tampa area. It's situated in a good place for a desalination plant, right next to a coal-burning power plant. So they have water right. They have power right there. But it took them years to get it started because they made all the mistakes. They didn't realize that you can't just take water from Tampa Bay and put it in. You have to clean everything out of it. So they totally fouled the entire facility and had to stop it for I can't remember how many years. Once they take everything out of the water, once they've taken the salt out, they have to put stuff back in, otherwise you wouldn't be able to drink it. I think the idea of desalinating ocean water, I think it would be, I don't think we could afford to do it. I think people would think of something else to do first.
Okay, I'm
Israel
sorry, we
does
have to
it,
move on.
yep.
So yes, here. Can you tell me your question so I can repeat it, please?
In the case of Colorado, it's a zero-sum, meaning they run out of water. The pie shape divides it up. But in the case of California, I'd read recently, the pie shape, and we show what goes to LA and agriculture and all the dividing, but we're only dividing up half the water. The other half, we're not capturing at all in California.
Okay.
We have the flooding and the water.
Okay,
yeah.
so the question's about how you divide, maybe we're not using up and sharing the water that may be paper water or may be wet water, and in California we may be particularly,
We're not talking about Colorado or river water, but things like
this is
right. And we're talking
California.
about rainwater that we're not
Right,
capturing.
and
Yeah,
snow-
and I think
snowmelt.
I think this takes back to the early 20th century idea that water is wasted if we haven't drunk it or put it on crops. But all that water that goes in the ground, that wasted rainwater, it goes into, it's what supports
that is kind of
it's
storage.
groundwater. And in fact, the Gulf of California is dying because no fresh water is coming into it from the top, along with all the nutrients that come with it. So it's not really wasted water. Colorado is unusual in that you don't have the right, or you didn't until recently, to harvest rainwater. And the reason was that it sounds crazy, but that water was part of a hydrologic system, and it belonged to somebody else. And that sounds like something from Crazy Town, but it actually makes sense. It means that they were thinking of the whole water system as a whole, which is something we tend not to do. Another way we don't do it is by not really thinking of groundwater as the same thing as surface water. The law reflects this, where there are, even in places that have strict regulations about surface water, like water in rivers and lakes, tend to often ignore groundwater. So on my property, this is true in Connecticut, I can take all the water I want to out of the well in my yard, even if it dries up my neighbors. That's it's my property. It doesn't make any sense to think of it the reason the law is like that is that when people started pumping water out of the ground, they had no idea where it came from. They didn't realize that there was a hydrologic connection between water they couldn't see and water they could see.
My water table is your water table?
Right, that we might share. That it was as much a shared resource as water on the surface. Colorado has this incredible, they have a water court system. There's 7 courts, and they govern groundwater.
Is there water jail to go with
right, there probably is. I never asked that, but I bet there's the equivalent.
And of course, in cities in California, you have bans on individual homes using rainwater storing, and that sort of thing is changing when gray water is now becoming legal too. Your hand raised back there, sir?
I've been coming to this desert since the 50s. I've always heard, there's a huge underground pool of water
Aquifer.
that will never run out. And yet, then I've heard, things are getting a little tough. Then I heard, we got an overabundance. Where's the water coming from, and when is the future?
All right. The question is whether or not, as he heard in the 50s, there's an immense aquifer, not so immense, no aquifer at all.
There is Palm Springs area does sit on top of an immense aquifer. It's fed by water that comes from the mountains. The idea was initially was you could never run out of it. I don't think that people now you actually get water from the Colorado River. It comes up the Coachella Canal from the All-American Canal, past the Salton Sea, comes up this way. And there's been more attention to water conservation in this area. Tucson, Arizona used to had been in a similar situation. It depended entirely, it was one of the biggest cities in the world that depended entirely on groundwater. And they eventually sucked it down far enough where it became uneconomical to pull it up. Water is really heavy. A gallon of water is 8 pounds. The farther down you go to pull it up, the more expensive, more energy it takes to get it up. And so the more you drain it, the deeper you have to go. The more compact, it's not a big tank down there, it's all in soils. The more compacted those are, the harder it is to pump it out. And the deeper you go, the nastier the water tends to be. There's more you have to do to it to make it potable. So there's even in places that have abundance, there's a point where you can use up a resource like that. There are places that, like Las Vegas, that carefully they depend about 10% of the water they use in Las Vegas comes from groundwater. They monitor it constantly. They add water to it. They check the quality. They make sure that it stays separated from this sort of horrible accidental man-made groundwater that kind of sits on top of it, which I don't know actually what the geology of this exact geology of this area is, but even if you have an enormous quantity, you can use it up. Saudi Arabia discovered that they had an aquifer the size of Lake Erie underneath the desert. They started pumping it in the 1980s, and they grew wheat in the desert. And they went from being a total wheat importer to being a very wealthy wheat exporter to other parts of the world. Well, that aquifer lasted about 25 years. They used up a Lake Erie's worth of water. Because that water was so-called fossil water, it didn't come from mountains nearby. It was there from, I don't know, the Ice Age or before. Once it was gone, there was no sustainable rate to remove it. They used it all up. Here, I think probably the big threat is what happens in the mountains with snowfall, with reduced precipitation. Mm-hmm. That's the hidden reservoir of Palm Springs and many other places. It's snow. It's snow as far away as Independence Pass in Colorado that makes its way all the way down.
And so this may be our new normal. Instead of gauging our water by the heaviest rainfall, we may start gauging it by virtually no rainfall at all. David Owen, you want to thank him, I'm sure, for his book and his insights. And I also want to make the pitch for,
Yeah.
don't pitch this stuff away. You've just heard his plea for how rare it is. Dump it back in the ground, never throw away a bottle of water. I embarrass my friends at restaurants by carrying out their water glasses when they're done and dumping them outside, so I'm notorious now as like the water glass queen. But anyway, thank you for coming. The book signing is afterwards.
Great. Thank you.